Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar titled Empowering Voices, Think Tanks as Catalysts in Democracy, Policy Influence, and Active Citizenship. My name is Marinos Papayoakim from Cartet, and I will be facilitating today's insightful discussion together with my colleague Savas Haralambous, Head of Communication in Cartet. Our aim is to deep into the significant role of think tanks, to the role that play in shaping democracy, influencing policy, and empowering citizens. We will explore both the positive and the negative aspects of their influence, and of course, discuss ways to balance these two in order to enhance the democratic participation and the policy making. This particular webinar is organized in the frame of the Emerge project, which is implemented by Cartet and Koumandos Sinzebisu in the framework of the Active Citizens Fund Cyprus project, funded through the EEA and the Norway 2014 and 2021 grant. Emerge project aims to promote active citizen participation and strengthen the civil society organization. To this end, the project implements a number of activities and events in order to deepen the citizens' knowledge and develop the CSO's capacity to transform their views and values into action that contribute to the improvement of our society. Today, with a great pleasure, we are hosting two esteemed speakers, Dr. Konstantinos Adamides, Director of the Diplomatic Academy of the University of Nicosia and Director of the Institute of Studies for Politics and Democracy, and Dr. Zenonas Tziarras from the Department of Turkish and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cyprus. We believe that their diverse background and extensive experience in think tanks will provide us with a comprehensive understanding of this particular topic. Gentlemen, thank you for accepting our invitation, and it's a great pleasure for having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So as we proceed, I encourage our...
Thank you.
As we proceed, I encourage our audience to reflect on the discussion and prepare any question you may have in the Q&A session at the end. So now let's begin our journey into the world of think tanks and their impact of our society. As a first comment, as a first question, let's say, I would like to ask our speakers, what is your involvement in think tanks, not only in Cyprus, but also abroad? Konstantinos can take this question and then Zenonas can follow.
Marinos, you asked for the involvement, you said. Our personal involvement, you mean, or the role of the think tanks in general?
Yes, your personal involvement.
Well, in Cyprus, I happen to run two think tanks. Well, co-run it. You never run a think tank by yourself. You always have associates and colleagues who help you run it. Otherwise, it's not a think tank. It's a one-person show, so it will not give the best output. So, and we've been doing this for quite some time, for well over a decade. And in Cyprus, we can discuss this, but the role of think tanks is not particularly widespread, and they're not particularly influential, as opposed to the think tanks abroad. I also happen to work with think tanks, big think tanks abroad, such as the Marshall Center for Security Studies, for instance, in Germany, which is a multi-million dollar think tank with hundreds of researchers. And they specialize in numerous areas. And of course, like most academics, we have also collaborated with think tanks abroad, such as Friedrich Dieper Stiftung or SWP, or many think tanks in general. So academia and think tanks usually go hand in hand, but I wouldn't say that it's a requirement necessarily to have just academics. I think this would actually be a mistake. To have just academics. We can discuss why this is the case later on. I don't know if Zenonas wants to add something to this.
Yes, Zenonas, please.
Yeah.
I know that you worked for PRIO some years ago.
Yeah, I worked for the Peace Research Institute Oslo in Cyprus for almost 4 years, I guess. Although PRIO does not consider itself to be a think tank. It's officially a research center, and That's the case because they have very strict academic standards. They participate in certain academic indexes, and they have, you know, positions like research professors and all that. It's not like the think tank market where you have analysts and so on. But I have collaborated with various think tanks in Cyprus and abroad as a consultant. I've participated in brainstorm sessions and written policy reports and consulted in political processes and so on. So although I don't run a think tank like Konstantinos does, I have some experience, and some of it is actually with Konstantinos. So hopefully we'll be able to shed some light on this issue today.
Yes, thank you very much. Indeed, is a very good point that was made by Konstantinos about the role of think tanks and the academics. You know, there are some perspectives that, you know, believe that think tanks are only for researchers and academics, but I mean, it is debatable since a lot of think tanks, especially abroad, they hire I mean, people from the industry or people that they're highly involved in politics in order to provide their views. So I mean, that was he did a very good comment and a very good point to clarify. Now about I mean, think tanks are there, and we know that they can influence. I mean, think tanks in democracy, and I mean, they can influence the policy. I mean, they can influence the people and their perspectives. So my first question goes to Konstantinos. So can you share, Konstantinos, your perspective on the role of think tanks in democracy in particular and policy influence, focusing on the positive aspect? And please, if you want to be more specific in regard to the positive aspect, which are linked with democracy and active participation.
Yeah. Well, I think before we engage in a discussion of how they influence, we must remember that we live in a new era where the information ecosystem has changed significantly, right? We live in a period, and this is going to continue, where information is shared widely on social media primarily by everyone. And this is a very important thing to remember, that now, unfortunately, opinions tend to matter more than science, at least in terms of influence, right? And this is because we live in an era of what we can call truth decay, that the truth doesn't really matter that much anymore, unfortunately. And this has a huge impact on democracy, because these people are voters, right? In democracies, you rely on the public to choose the next leaders, to choose the policies they will push for, to choose the policies they will reject. So the fact that we have this period of truth decay, where opinions by anyone actually matters more than science, makes think tanks even more important. And this is where I would like to start, saying that think tanks, if they're doing their jobs correctly, they have the capacity to contribute towards presenting positions based on science and expertise, and not just on opinions. And the opinions, of course, exist, but they are based on facts and expertise. So in this regard, think tanks do have the capacity, just like universities, to conduct research and disseminate information that is much more accurate, or at least more educated, if you wish. And hopefully this information will be disseminated either directly to the public, and therefore influence the society, the base level, if you wish, or, just like think tanks abroad, influence the decision makers. So the role of think tanks, as opposed to government agencies, among other things, one of the positive things is that it can play both sides. It can play the audience and it can play with the political elite and the decision makers. And this can have a very good effect if done correctly and if done in collaboration, right? Because sometimes what is missing is this link between the decision makers and the audiences. And this is one area that think tanks can play a big role. Another area is, depending on the think tanks, to have a specific expertise. For instance, at the Diplomatic Academy, we work a lot with embassies. We work a lot with foreign missions. We help them with their public diplomacy. On the other Institute of Politics and Democracy, we focus a lot more on issues related to democracy and politics, as the name suggests. So, depending on the expertise of each think tank, there's a lot to give out. And so, it's policy development, it's research, it's dissemination, and more importantly, I would say that it allows for public discussions, not in the literal sense, but by presenting some positions and by organizing events, it allows for the public to not only learn, but also to engage with potential decision makers, or at the very minimum, with individuals who can influence decision makers. So these are some of the very good benefits, if you wish, of think tanks, if they have the capacity to do something. We can discuss what limitations are later on, but this is a key thing, because in principle, these are benefits. In practice, if you cannot, as a think tank, produce the output that you want to produce, then it's pointless. You multiply something by zero, basically, so the outcome would be zero.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. And I would like to add on these positive aspects of the think tanks, two important points. The one is the networking opportunities that the think tanks offer. And the second is some activities that they're doing. For example, some internship that they offer, some fellowship program, which basically shape the perceptions of future leaders. So I think this is another positive aspect of the think tanks, and it's something that we know very well, especially the people that they work in academia, that they have these opportunities. Any other comments from you, Konstantinos? Zenonas, feel free to add on these positive aspects of think tanks if you wish.
Yeah, I just maybe not directly, but perhaps I'd like to take a step back and maybe frame what Konstantinos was saying, so that we better understand, the role of think tanks and their position in society. Today we could put think tanks under two big categories. We could, on the one hand, see government-affiliated think tanks, and on the other hand, independent non-profit think tanks. So the former category is self-explanatory. So looking at the second category of independent think tanks, we could associate them, both categories, with policy and policymaking in general. And if we look at the independent think tanks, and I think this is what Konstantinos was talking about before, I believe they are on a different track than official decision makers. So if official government state policymakers are, let's say, track one, related to the first category, then independent think tanks are generally considered track two, or sometimes track 1.5. And therefore, they are often included under the umbrella category of civil society. And this is where it gets interesting, because civil society in the context of democracy is basically, this vibrant sort of community from different organizations and social movements that are able to express themselves and affect official decisions and the environment where they live in, be it, economically, security-wise, technologically, sociologically, and so on. And think tanks are supposed to be providing the space and the means to do that in certain ways, and also become the voice of reason, hopefully, provides data-driven perspectives and proposals, as well as create the forum where important discussions take place. Maybe because often governments don't do that, and you need someone else to steer discussions and maybe bring government officials in and create some sort of a mix with government, political parties, social organizations. We call them civil society organizations, and different other aspects of the public, so that that officials not only speak, but they also listen. Now, this is a positive aspect. However, I would be, a bit, let's say, I'm not sure whether officials or people who come into this fora actually listen. It's not often the case. Very often they're there just to show, to show face, to save face, to project or promote their own agendas, even pretending to listen because they're in a certain setting. But it's not often the case that meaningful outcomes come out of this discussion. I don't want to be very pessimistic about it. Sometimes they do produce results, but in my experience, it's not very often.
Thank you very much, Zenonas. I think that was a very good connection with the second question that goes to Zenonas about, let's say, the negative or the challenges that the think tanks are facing, and I want to focus on the issue of bias and influence. I mean, we know that Zenonas already mentioned that there are accusations of some ideological biases or the people that are behind. Zenonas also mentioned the government sponsor think tanks. So what is your view, Zenonas, on this? I mean, first, I will be very interested in your view about the bias, which is, I think, very important point, taking also your academic profession. Yeah. And you can mention also some other challenges that the think tanks are facing.
Well, let's just say that the first think tanks were created before the Second World War, and there was only a handful of think tanks, and were primarily affiliated with governments in the sector of military technology. And they only proliferated drastically after the Second World War. And many of them were, in some way or another, trying to push the government towards certain directions, and other think tanks were supported or funded by the government, and that was in the US specifically, and then it expanded in the world. And I'm saying this because traditionally think tanks have had this, let's say, paradoxical, sometimes controversial relationship with the circles of the government, or even the broader industry, let's say, different sectors of the industry. And today we have reports and indexes about think tanks worldwide that sort of record even the political biases of each think tank. You would get, tables saying, this is left-wing and this is right-wing and this is centrist, liberal, conservative, and blah, 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 and so on. Because it's very important to know the landscape if you want to be informed by these think tanks, and also know what their connections are with political parties or certain corporations or even governments. So it's one thing to look at the big picture, but and see that think tanks have a positive aspect, and they are meant to have a positive role in society. But in fact, the inner workings of think tanks are much more complex. Their funding often comes from government or government affiliated or political party affiliated institutions, or big corporations, as I said, that want to indirectly or even directly, so they try all routes towards affecting policy making, right? the scope of their research and sometimes the very results of the research depend on what the funding body prioritizes and would like to hear. Because, you know, telling the funding body what would like to hear sometimes results in more funding. So these are tricky issues. And also think tanks paradoxically tend to be characterized by groupthink mentalities. Groupthink mentality would be a mentality where a community of thinkers shares similar or same ideas. And therefore, it's very difficult to think outside the box and produce more productive ideas and proposals, usually being confined by the bubble of their common and shared ideas. And moreover, most think tanks focus on very specific themes and areas that are often ideologically that often have ideologically informed agendas. Let's say, you know, think tanks on, you know, that do military research, they usually have a conservative you know, spin, or maybe think tanks that tend to deal with cultural or social issues tend to have a more liberal spin. You have environmental think tanks that have sort of specific agendas when it comes to the economy and the environment and energy policies and so on. So even though these think tanks try to use data and being objective in presenting ideas and proposals, more often than not, they do serve some kind of an agenda. And I'm not saying that's bad. I mean, many people have agendas, right? And we need to have agendas if we want to promote what we feel that it's true and right. So that's not per se problematic or wrong. But it does get problematic if that's like if that becomes politicized and the agenda is prioritized over truth seeking, truth finding, and data driven proposals. And that's where the problem is, and that's where the interconnection with funding and other connections and affiliations also comes into play. So against this background, we could say that just like politics in general, the think tank landscape is very much affected by power dynamics and power games. So yes, they do create space and provide alternative means, voices to be heard, but the constraining factors I just mentioned often render the think tanks susceptible to the influence of external actors who are also the main agenda setters internationally. Think like, I mean, the United States, for example, or NATO states, or huge corporations who are able to affect the economy, affect security agendas, and these actors fund think tanks and shape their own research agendas, which later produce research outcomes, which then become public outputs that affect the public opinion. And basically, it's a top-down sort of reproduction of ideas and power that then legitimizes the agenda of the most powerful. So that's a very tricky issue to be aware of. I mean, I got more, but I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Zenonas. I mean, as you said at the beginning, you're not promoting a pessimistic view, but I mean, indeed, they are all valid points that you have raised, and we have to be very careful. You know, when we're let's say judging, allow me the word, the think tanks, we have to take into consideration not only the positive aspects, which indeed they exist, they're out there, but at the same time, we have to take into consideration the challenges that they face. Last but not least, a question that goes to Konstantinos, again, about the challenges of think tanks. You know, the question that exists, I know that it is a 1 million question. Do they actually influence the think tanks? I mean, how can we measure their influence or their impact? I mean, I would be interested to have your view on this.
Right. Obviously, it's not a a math problem, right? That you can find causality immediately. I just want to echo what Zenonas said just a little bit, because this has to do with the influence. And I agree, we have to be extremely careful, but I will take a slightly less pessimistic view. Even though I do not disagree with anything that Zenonas said, I actually agree with everything. I'm just going to put a different spin on it. And specifically the ideological foundation of think tanks. If there is transparency to that, then there might not be, the harm might not be as big as one might think, right? So transparency here is key. And we see that both in the US and in countries like Germany, for instance, the fact that the money comes from the government based on the political party's powers, basically, right? So if you look at the German case, for instance, the money that they get, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of euros for these think tanks, depends on how powerful the political party is. But the money doesn't come through the party, but rather directly from the government in an effort to maintain as much autonomy as possible without depending on the political party for funding. That said, we should expect that the positions created will echo to some extent the ideological foundations of the party they represent. So there's no doubt about that. Again, however, that's not necessarily bad if it's data-driven. The problem is if they use the think tank to legitimize, like Zenonas said, the positions that, so if you do research and you reach an outcome and then the politicians take it and they say, listen, based on this outcome, we propose that we do this and that, that's good, that's healthy. Now, if the politicians come and say, I want you to prove that this is what we need to do, so you kind of create research just to prove something that, to legitimize, to launder, if you wish, a position, then that's kind of negative. So do they have an influence? I think the answer is yes. In the sense that in big countries and countries that do have traditions in think tanks, they do influence key political leaders in the Senate or in the parliament, key decision makers. And frequently what these think tanks will do is they will bring attention to specific issues so that those issues are placed on the political agenda, whether it is geographical issues or technological issues or competition-related issues and so on and so forth. So what makes think tanks different from governments, however, is that they can engage with an international audience much easier compared to governments. Zenonas and I both have a lot of experience going to Germany, for instance, because XY think tanks decided that the Eastern Mediterranean is now worthy of attention. And what do? They bring people from Cyprus, from Greece, from Turkey, from whatever country they think is important. This is not easily done on a government level. On a think tank level, this is possible. So assuming the think tank will then produce reports that are genuine and honest based on these external people's views, then this can actually have a positive impact, or at least a comprehensive impact, if you will, a comprehensive approach, because it listened to Cypriots, to whatever, Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, Turks, Greeks, and so on and so forth. Now, what the political elite do, that's the million-dollar question. So if that report does not support their established views and agendas, then do they ignore it or do they change their minds? And I think it's hard to take a black and white position here. It depends. Especially in social sciences, it's easy to argue that you can find counter arguments for everything. It's very hard to have super concrete evidence that would change easily one's mind. What I can tell you from experience is that big centers like the Marshall Center, once the government realizes that a country or a region is important, what they do is they start structuring their activities in a way that would facilitate more knowledge coming from think tanks, both their own and others, in a way that would facilitate the overall political goal of the state from which they get their funding. So the Marshall Center is a very good example of that. It decided that the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans, for instance, are key areas. So they started doing events. They started collaborating with local NGOs and think tanks in Cyprus and elsewhere. They started inviting people from those countries in order to shape reports that would then be sent back to the Department of Defense or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the State Department or whatever. So in that respect, there is an impact. It's hard to quantify exactly to what extent that impact is, but there is an impact. Frequently, of course, like Zenonas very, very correctly noted, you have these events, you have politicians showing up, they give a welcome speech, and then they think, I have to go, and that's it. They don't even listen. They just go there, take a couple of photos. We are happy because we had a minister. They're happy because they did their public diplomacy thing, but nobody won, right? It was just a parade of faces without particular importance. If it's super tailored, then it can have an impact. So if you have, for instance, an ambassador talking as a keynote, and then he or she has to stay there to answer questions and this and that, then that can have another impact in the sense that the audience, students, for instance, can actually talk to an ambassador. And this is the benefit of small countries. In big countries, unless you're in the top university like Harvard and, or in DC like George Washington and so on, it's very unlikely that you see a minister have the opportunity to talk to a minister or an ambassador. In Cyprus, we do have this opportunity, and it's quite common. So in that respect, the ability to meet these people is there. Now, the impact is questionable, but at least you have this opportunity.
Thank you, Konstantinos. Let me also add on the impact point, the role of media. I mean, we know that think tanks, they have very strong media connection. So the think tanks can influence the public discourse, the journalists, which is, I mean, from the positive side, they can help the citizens to become more informed and more engaged, which is something that we want, which is one of the aspects of this project, the active citizenship. I agree with both of you that the impact cannot be measured exactly in terms of number, but if you influence even one person, one key person, number is not the the key, but the key person that you can influence.
Depends towards which direction, of course, right? Because if you influence a person towards the wrong direction, then you do more damage than good. And this goes back to what Zenonas said. I mean, if you take the US, for instance, you have think tanks that are extremely reputable, extremely rich, but they're very hawkish, very, very pro-war, pro-conflicts, pro-this, pro-that, because they serve specific interests, or simply because they perceive that for the US, for instance, this is the best approach, a more hawkish approach. So they don't necessarily do it for the money, but they do it because ideologically they truly believe that this is the best approach. So yeah, influence. That's what we meant with how you legitimize positions. Think tanks must be careful, not to become a tool for legitimization of wrong actions.
Can I add something on the impact aspect? So obviously we're not saying that think tanks are doomed to advocate for someone else's agenda, but I think we're suggesting that being truly independent in this context is a constant struggle. That usually, the more powerful think tanks, as Konstantinos was saying, the voice of which gets heard more, are usually the most compromised, quote unquote, not always, but often compromised in terms of, what they advocate and how they advocate it, although there are many exceptions. While the more independent think tanks with more alternative perspectives are usually the smaller or weaker ones, and therefore the ones that don't have as much impact. Of course, we do see, and I think that's an important point, we do see that over the years, agendas change as certain issues become more popular and more of a necessity. And especially when industries and governments are ready to reprioritize their own agenda items. So a few examples are, climate change, migration, especially technology, cyberspace, and AI in recent years. So these issues are very popular right now in the research community, much more than in the past. Although technology was always big, I think think tanks have more of an impact when they manage to sort of speak to agenda items of powerful actors. It's more difficult to raise and change the agenda as a think tank, although it may be important to do so. And it's a bit easier to identify agenda items that are important for specific actors and try to impact those specific items. So if X country or X foreign ministry wants to be more active on a certain international issue and goes to a certain think tank because it needs some input or some insight on that issue, then there's your opportunity to do research and offer informed proposals about those important issues. When it comes to raising issues, new issues on the agenda, I believe that public events are not as successful as perhaps private closed-door events. So if you really want to be impactful as a think tank, it would probably be more productive to bring stakeholders together behind closed doors where they will feel more comfortable to listen to you and react more naturally and share with them, the bare facts and get them to understand that if you do not listen, then there will be repercussions. So this is, doing it publicly. Politicians have a difficulty reacting in a natural and even objective way. They will hide behind agendas. They will try to save face. They will say big words. But behind closed doors, they may even think about it and go back to their offices and start, doing something about it. So think tanks sometimes should act as lobbyists, even though that's not their words, really.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your insights on the topic. Of course, this is a huge topic that we need a lot of hours of webinars to discuss this. But I mean, this is, I think, an opportunity for you and also for the audience, to have your views as person that you were involved in think tanks. Now, narrowing down to the Cyprus environment and context, I would like to ask you both of you. I mean, what is the situation in Cyprus about think tanks? I mean, are citizens influenced directly or indirectly by the think tanks? Do we actually have think tanks? I mean, with the traditional way of understanding of think tanks. Anyone can take this question.
I think we have a long way to go. The truth is, we have a very long way to go. A good example of the Institute of Studies for Politics and Democracy, for instance, this is the effort to bring in international and local researchers, but still, it's in its infancy. Right? It takes a lot of time. I don't think that people are influenced by think tanks in Cyprus. I don't think think tanks have the role they should have for many reasons. We're a closed society. We have an existential threat that occupies every discussion. Everything becomes hyper-politicized. Everybody's an expert. in Cyprus, for every issue, from the Cyprus problem to football, to pandemics, So this is another major problem, that we have these bubbles that we cannot easily penetrate, right? We cannot easily change the societal way of thinking. And this will take time. And for this to happen, think tanks must be very, very serious, very professional, very transparent as well. And I think this is a key issue for countries like Cyprus, that everybody knows everyone and everybody has heard someone who knows something, and they will post it, and they will. So there are many spoilers, and it's easy to spoil things. So transparency is extremely important in smaller countries where there's direct contact from people who know someone. So yeah, there is a lot of room for influence in Cyprus, but unfortunately at this point, we rely a lot more on individuals, I would say, rather than think tanks as institutions. Again, there are some think tanks, there is progress, there is potential, but still we're not there yet, in my opinion.
Thank you. And before I pass the floor to Zenonas, I kindly ask our audience, since we're approaching the Q&A part, in case you have any comments or any questions, feel free to drop your comments or questions in the chat box, and I think that our speakers will be happy to answer this. Thank you. Zenonas, please.
Yeah. About 10 years ago, I was at a university abroad, and I was walking in a corridor, and I saw a door. And the door read on it, Center for so-and-so. And I opened the door, and there was one person in it, and that was a think tank. So that was a one-man show, but let me tell you, that one man got a 3 million euro funding to do research on a specific policy issue. In Cyprus, we have many doors with big names and single persons behind them without the funding and without the infrastructure. And basically, what they do is serve very narrowly, very narrow agendas or interests or purposes or whatever. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's not a think tank. So we need to define what we mean by think tank. Think tank is an organization that is able to acquire funding in legitimate ways and transparent ways, obviously, that will enable it to bring in experts either from industry or the policy sector or the academic community, and brainstorm and actually think, and do research and produce proposals and ideas for the betterment of society. We don't have that in Cyprus, really. We have exceptions, very few exceptions, and I'm not an expert on every sector. Like, I don't know what's going on in the environmental sector, for example, or the economic sector. I know in terms of international affairs or politics and society generally. So I don't want to generalize too much, but as Konstantinos said, the think tank field in Cyprus, the landscape in Cyprus is very underdeveloped. It has a long way to go, and I think a good way to revisit the issue of think tanks in Cyprus, it's to start reframing and re-understanding and redefining what a think tank is and what it should do, so that whoever decides to undertake such a thing actually does it in the right way and is effective at the end of the day.
And beyond the conceptual,
just to add, Marino, yes. This thinking that Zenonas very correctly noted must translate not just in public events, but in publications that are influential, right? And I don't mean academic publications as in journals that 5 people read it. I mean in the kind of publications that forces politicians to take a position on a subject, So we've seen, for instance, someone saying, Rand Institute said this, or whatever, Brookings said that, or Hudson said the other thing. And all of a sudden, political elite and decision makers must take a position. They must acknowledge this publication. But the think tank must have significant weight to force people to take that publication into consideration. Otherwise, it's pointless.
Beyond the conceptual discussion that, of course, I agree with all of the points that have been raised, there is also the logistics and the practical part, which is the funding. I mean, it's one of the most important aspects of the funding, which creates a lot of issues in some cases. If you have, I mean, independently, if you have people that they have the knowledge, they have the expertise, they have the willingness to run a think tank. In some cases, you have limitations and barriers due to funding. So this is another aspect that we have to take into consideration. And this is linked, of course, with the challenges that has been mentioned previously, which is, when you have the funder and maybe you want to not escape from the bubble, as Konstantinos said, of his or her approach. We have, thank you for your comments on this. We have a comment. Thank you for the for your comment about the discussion. I think this is a more question for Konstantinos. We have people that they want to actively participate in the Diplomatic Academy. I assume that they can visit the website, the social media. Please, Konstantinos.
Just email us if I think it's best if we discuss any potential collaborations over email rather than here. Yeah.
Very good. Any other comments, questions by the audience? Feel free to open your mics. This is an open discussion. I mean, we need your opinion on this.
There's another question in the chat.
Sorry, maybe I missed the question.
I think that's a very interesting question, the debate amongst the experts and mistrust towards the mistrust and distrust will only grow. And this is how I started the conversation, saying that we live in a period where opinions matter less than facts. And it's extremely easy to say, I don't like what that expert says. I hate the word expert, by the way. I don't like whatever that person says. I'm just going to go with what feels right? And we live in a period where we have extremely strong and resilient confirmation biases. We just want to hear what we already believe in, right? Rather than actually hear something that makes more sense. Whether this is about, I don't know, the East Med pipeline, Zenonas and I mean, experience this a lot, or whether it's on Greco-Turkish relations or Brexit or any other issue. And the problem when you have heated debates is what both Zenonas and I try to emphasize is the effort to legitimize through scientific appearing approaches the positions. And that's a very, very dangerous thing. The problem becomes then that if you disagree, if you have in a polarized situation, you will agree that we pro-Brexit or anti-Brexit, you will agree with the ones you want anyway. And what happens is you simply not just mistrust the political elite who support the position, but also the academics and experts who support your opposing views. And that is indeed a very big problem on issues of where you have highly polarized situations. Now, the elitism, well, I think we have to be very careful not to dismiss expertise. So, for instance, if you take the pandemics, all of a sudden, everybody had an opinion on whether vaccines would work or not work, or they have these side effects. I don't know. All of a sudden, everybody knew something and they were absolutely 100% certain on what the outcome would be. This is a very good example. So imagine in politics and societal issues that everybody has super strong opinions. If we were all of a sudden doctors and, I don't know, pandemic experts, you know, so you can imagine for issues that affect society.
Zenonas, any comments on this particular question?
Yeah. I think two things. One, we should always remember that science is dynamic, right? It's not like we discovered something 100 years ago, scientifically speaking, and we can use it in the same way today. Yes, gravity doesn't change, but science on vaccines, for example, as Konstantinos said, or science on artificial intelligence or military technology changes all the time. And when someone calls you to speak about these things as an expert, you need to be up to date with the most recent science and be modest enough to accept that maybe your opinion and your knowledge and the facts that we have right now about the specific issue is not enough or adequate to provide a conclusive answer about the issue. And we need to be open and modest enough to be vulnerable within those situations, because otherwise we develop rigid belief systems and rigid positions that do not allow us to adapt to the environment and develop according to the circumstances of the age. That's one thing. And the second thing is that there is a systemic problem when it comes to informing the public. Because, speaking about Cyprus, but this is true for other countries as well, you have specific, in Greece also, you have specific media channels, for example, or newspapers or radio channels that usually, not all of them, but many of them, like to promote specific political agendas because of the people who are behind them. And because of that, they usually invite specific experts who more often than not are not really experts. They're involved in some way or another, or were involved 20 years ago and haven't read a book about this issue for 20 years. And they call them to comment on something that is very current, and they don't even know what happened yesterday. And then they have this very strong opinion about, what should happen or how things are. And this obviously coming from an expert mouth, then produces and reproduces specific attitudes and opinions within the public that are false. And this in turn affects the political and electoral attitudes. So you can see the systemic problem. And also it's quite technical at some time, very practical at sometimes. As simple, for example, as that very often a TV presenter needs to have someone on the panel to speak about something, and they are not able to find someone who is a legitimate expert on the issue. So they call the next best thing, which is someone who doesn't know anything about the issue. And you end up having these public sort of ideas being exposed that are very either problematic or half-truths or not scientific or not data-driven, and so on and so forth. So we need to identify the parts of this system that is problematic, this cycle, and address them one by one if we are ever able to sort of break it.
And this is where think tanks can become relevant, because by definition, individuals who focus on a specific issue for a profession, let's take disinformation, for instance, right? We organized a workshop a few weeks ago, and we had an expert from the Atlantic Council where they have a unit focusing on disinformation. Those people in that unit are focusing on this issue. They're up to date, like Zenonas said, like day in, day out, they knew what happened yesterday, right? So if you have think tanks, you are much more likely to send knowledgeable individuals, knowledgeable experts to the media, so that you don't have the effects that Zenonas mentioned. so the absence of serious think tanks also limits the breadth of expertise.
I think it's all of these points are very important and give us the opportunity for a webinar volume 2 on think tanks. I don't know if we have any other questions since we ran out of time. We have another 5 minutes. I don't know anyone from the audience they would like to comment something, or maybe also share your view. I mean, it's also important to have also your view. If not, allow me for the last question. As you know, as we mentioned in this project, Emerge, active citizenship and active citizens is the core, and of course CSOs is the core concept in this project. So I would like to combine the role of active citizens, the role of citizens, with your field, guys, with the international affairs, with your field of expertise. And my question is, I would like to provide us an example from the international, either from the Cyprus context, but I would prefer from the international level, where the citizens, they actually shape the international agenda, of course, taking into consideration the limitations that they have. Do you have any kind of these examples?
Zena, you want to take this?
I know that you are in the realist school of thought, so I know that, I mean, your approach, but at the same time, we can. There are examples where there is an influence at the level that can influence the international agenda. Please.
Yeah. Well, look, society historically has impacted, history and historical developments very much. But when that happened, it was mostly in the form of social movements, uprisings, revolutions, protests, and so on. Not so much in the form of CSOs or think tanks. I can find many examples in terms of social movements, starting from the French Revolution to all the way to the Arab Spring and the fall of the Soviet Union and all that. But I'm trying to think about, such impact in terms of think tanks. And I mean, if we exclude state-funded projects, right, through think tanks, I think it will be very difficult to find. I mean, it's not impossible, and I'm sure it's out there. I don't know enough. But the fact that I cannot easily think of such change through think tanks tells me that they haven't been nearly as impactful as society at large, which perhaps tells us something about the ways of mobilization that need to be followed and in the future. And one thing that technology and social media have created is the sense of rebellion, but from the comfort of one's sofa. So you express all that sentiment, you express all your opposition, and you rebel from the comfort of your own home on social media. You get it out of your system, and then you are less prone to be more energetic, more active in wanting change. At least that's my that's the sense that I have with that. This is not like some sort of scientific research or anything, but this is the sense I have from society today, which is I feel it's very idle, very vocal, but at the same time very idle. But I mean, I know this doesn't answer your question about think tanks, and this is perhaps the answer.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It's societies that matter. Now, if think tanks can mobilize societies, they can contribute, they can have a multiplier effect, but unless societies are ready to make a change, yeah, I cannot recall a think tank having such a big impact on global affairs. On domestic affairs, yes. I mean, that is indeed possible. They might, just like media outlets, right? They might bring something to the surface and create change. But global affairs, I find it hard to find evidence for that. Yeah. But then again, I don't know. Maybe there is, but it's not to my knowledge.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think it's time to close this webinar. Just making a recap. I think it's clear that the think tanks can play. They have a role in democracy, in policy influence and active citizenship. Since, as you said, they can offer knowledge, expertise. But at the same time, we notice that they are facing a lot of challenges. One of the important words is transparency, which is very important to the think tanks. So it's very important to balance when we're talking about think tanks, to balance these positive and negative or challenging aspects in order to ensure that they have a constructive role in taking the opportunity. I would like to thank Konstantinos Adamides and Zenonas Tziarras. It was an honor to have you here with us, and you have to commit yourself for another event in the frame of this project. I think that the discussion was very interesting. And of course, I would like to thank our audiences. I mean, the majority of people, they stay in the whole time of the webinar, which means something. Let me underline that we have in this series of webinars, in this webinar series, we have another 3 in the following. It's every Wednesday for the month January. So we have next week on the 17th, 24th, and 31st. You will receive emails invitation. Also, you can follow our social media on Cartel and also on Emerge Project to follow for any updates. Let me also thank Cartel team for the support for the organization of this event, and we hope that we're going to see you all in the following activities and events of this project. Again, thank you very much to the speakers, the audience, and let's keep in touch.